All right. I am here. This is Paul Holcomb, and to talk to you about the resurrection. Is it a myth or a miracle? Ultimately, the question to answer being, is there good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? And so, in doing that, of course, we'll look to see, is this a myth? That's something that people hold on to, or is it, in fact, of course, a miracle? And really, what's important to start this conversation is what's at stake when it comes to Christianity. And the Apostle Paul, when he was writing to the church in Corinth, he says this. He says, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. Ultimately, it's not worth anything. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For even if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins." And so there are a lot of layers to what the Apostle Paul is saying. But ultimately, if Jesus is not resurrected, what he's saying is our faith is in vain. We don't have hope, and really, he's just a big fat liar. That's what Paul's trying to tell us. And so when it comes to the resurrection, of course, there are many objections, but these are some of the biggest objections that one might encounter. The first one is the fact that someone coming back from the dead, quite simply, that's just unbelievable. It seems magical. It seems on the level of, Harry Potter or something to that effect. And thus, we could dismiss the resurrection based upon the fact that it just doesn't seem very likely. Another objection is that this belief in the resurrection is one that just came about at a much later date. And so ultimately, in this objection, what they're saying is that Jesus wasn't in fact resurrected, but as time went on, people took this idea of Jesus and they made him into much more than he is and embellished this idea of a resurrection coming back from the dead. Third, of course, is mass hallucinations. The idea that a group of people kind of together can be convinced of really anything. And as grouped together, the disciples and even the 500 that Paul would mention to the church in Corinth, they were just deluded. Jesus really didn't come back. They just kind of hallucinated the whole thing. Another objection is that the resurrection was simply metaphorical. Basically, what this objection is telling us is that, well, Jesus didn't rise literally, he rose metaphorically in the sense that Jesus is always with us, his teachings are always with us, and thus we can hold on to this Christ and this idea of Christianity. Another objection is that it's just simply on par with the myths of Greco-Roman literature, that as people look to other stories, they took those stories and basically they just co-opted Jesus into them in order to form the belief system that we have today and to kind of provide us with this hope that I'm sure they would argue really doesn't exist. And then the final would be naturalistic explanations, such as, well, when the disciples went, when Mary went, they just simply went to the wrong tomb. Or maybe Jesus just never died. This is more popularly known as the swoon theory, that essentially Jesus on the cross had the wherewithal to kind of fake his death so he wouldn't have to actually die. And then, of course, there's one that just simply says, well, the body was just stolen by the disciples, and they used this to dupe the people in the first century, and of course, all the way down through the 21st century. And so, in taking these objections one by one, the first one that I think is important to address, of course, is the resurrection in itself unbelievable? Because on its face, someone coming back from the dead certainly doesn't seem, well, at the very least, probable or even likely. There's a man by the name of Craig Keener, and he has found many witnesses as he's researched two miracles. One study of Pentecostals and charismatics going across 10 countries around the world, there are 200 million people in this study that claim to witness some sort of spiritual or divine healing. Now, if that's not enough, and this is really what Keener claims, they say, okay, well, what if you're not charismatic and you're not Pentecostal? Because those are certainly very unique groups that certainly seem to gravitate more towards divine healing and miracles. Well, it says 39% is what he comes to of Christians outside of those two categories, neither Pentecostal nor charismatic. They claim witnesses to divine and spiritual and ultimately miraculous healing. And his claim in that through his research is that maybe up to 1/3 of Christians worldwide that they ascribe to this idea that miracles can happen, and thus it tells us that there are a lot of people, starting with the 200 million. Plus, if we look at 1/3 of Christians, and if we just think about how many that is around the globe, they believe in the miraculous, and so we can't dismiss them just out of hand. This is evidence that we do have to at least, well, we have to address, but we also have to entertain what they're saying. But the argument that often accompanies is, okay, well, that's fine, but these are second or third world countries, and because of that, it's not in the West where the inadvertent claim is we're just so much more enlightened than all the rest. But in a 2008 Pew Forum study, which was focused just on the United States, we found 34% of Americans, they claim to have witnessed divine and supernatural healing. And one thing that Keener points out that's interesting is that we aren't just talking about Christians, we are talking about people that go across faiths. And so if this belief is a fallacy, if it's wrong at all, you still have a lot of people that are ascribing to this divine and supernatural healing. And in turn, we have to go towards that evidence and address all of those people. We can't just dismiss them, as I've said. But it also lets us know that the idea of a resurrection is not, well, it's not impossible. And so, is it unbelievable? Perhaps we could say that it is, just based upon the fact that so many reject Christ's resurrection, but not unbelievable in the sense of when we put facts to the question that the miraculous can happen, and in this case, the resurrection. Another objection, second on the list that I provided, was a late belief. And it's interesting because New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann, he refutes this view. And what's intriguing about Gerd Ludemann providing this is he wasn't a believer. He's not a believer in the resurrection. But all of that said, he said there's no way that the belief in a resurrection came about too late. And what he does is he points to 1 Corinthians 15, which I've addressed earlier in the presentation. And he says, you look at that book and that chapter in context, you find a creedal tradition that already exists. And so this heart of the tradition is already in place by the time that the Apostle Paul is converted, which places 2 to 3 years from Jesus's death. Ultimately, what this means for us is that this wasn't developed over time. Whether you contend that they hallucinated, they made it up, whatever it was, the belief that Jesus Christ was resurrected and the tomb was empty was well in place by the time that Paul writes this book, in I believe the 50s AD. And so what Gerdeman concludes is that this is in place from 1 to 2 years after Jesus's death. It's not an evolution of an idea that goes across time and space and over centuries. It's something that early Christians and the early ancient world, they ascribe to, that Jesus either did or apparently did come back from the dead. Now, another one that it's easy to pose this one, and the idea of did all these people, the disciples, the claims within the gospel that they just ran into somebody like Jesus, did they just have mass hallucinations? And we see this kind of today. You can see it through movies like Stigmata, which is kind of dated, but you have like a statue of Jesus, I believe that's apparently he's weeping and it's tears of blood. You probably can't go a year where somebody doesn't claim to see the Virgin Mary in a cloud or in a grilled cheese sandwich or in a screen door. And I say all that, not even tongue in cheek. That is a claim that certainly gets mass appeal. But what studies have found is that when somebody has an hallucination, when a group of people have an hallucination on this scale, that normally only occurs in conjunction with something like a focus on a fixed entity. So as I said before, statues or paintings or a cloud or even, the infamous grilled cheese, it's something that everyone's focusing on and is static and doesn't move. But the Gospels themselves, they don't record just one central sighting. They don't have a time where Jesus shows up and he's kind of levitated in the air, or he shows up on the Mount of Olives and then he just produces the fact and makes the claim he's Jesus and then disappears. That isn't the way the story is told. It's certainly not what is believed. But Jesus does show up in multiple different places at different times. And this is important because there's no way that this hallucination is something that can catch from different times and places. And so the objection of mass hallucinations really just falls by the wayside when you start to consider it. Another objection is whether Jesus's resurrection is just metaphorical. Maybe it's something that people believed as a concept that Jesus is always with us, as a spirit's always with us, and we can never lose this Jesus in that way. And that's what was meant in the first century. Um, it's important to note that bodily resurrection is a very, very rare belief for the Greco-Roman world, which is what we're talking about. Well, ultimately, we're talking about a group of people that live in this Greco-Roman world, very heavily influenced by them. It's in fact only the Jews, with the exception of the Sadducees, who Jesus talks about the resurrection in the Gospels, but it's only the Jews that have a belief in a bodily resurrection. That was a norm for them. We can go back to Elijah raising the dead. We can go back to Elisha anointing the boy. The idea of resurrection is one that is only held by people of the Jewish faith. And the Jews themselves were the first Christians. And so they're not going to be affected by the outside view in the Greco-Roman world. It doesn't take other people around them for them to believe in a literal bodily resurrection. And so if the Jews are the first Christians, then this belief comes from them, not from the outside world. And so because of their belief, we can stand very, very firm that this concept wasn't meant to be metaphorical, that Jesus was literally raised. The next objection that we have is whether this was based on myth or not. There's a man by the name of David Litwa, and he does research that focuses on, and I'm probably going to butcher these names, but Asclepius, Heracles, and Romulus. And if we compare these three individuals, because he heavily focuses on them, we have to not just notice the similarities, which Litwa does, of course, but we have to also notice the differences. None of these people lived as actual humans. They were myth from the start. They are not based upon somebody like Jesus, who even Bart Ehrman, the famous agnostic professor, writes this whole book on, did Jesus exist? And of course, he comes down to, historically, Jesus does exist. None of these people appear to a large group of people. Ultimately, they'll appear to individuals, but over a really long span of time. It's not a 3 days to a 40-day cycle in which we see with Christ. And what's important also to note about these fictional individuals is none of them were founders of a religion. If the contention that Lit was making is that we're just modeling Jesus after these people, they would be incredibly poor models because they didn't really make anything. I mean, of course, Romulus is kind of credited with the building of Rome, but even that in itself is taken as myth building within the Greco-Roman culture. And what's even further is that if you are going to start a religion with Jesus Christ, then you're going to need to reverse the perception that Jesus is cursed by dying on the tree, because this is the ultimate belief by rabbis of the time. Taking the verse from Deuteronomy, I think it's 23, it says, whoever's killed or hangs on a tree is accursed. And rabbis in the first century had looked to crucifixion and they had taken it and said, okay, this is the exact thing that God was intending. So because of its severity and its cruelty, that is a curse. And all of that to say that if you're going to start a religion, number one, you don't start with mythical people because that's a poor base. But two, you don't start with such a poor story. The idea that you would have this cursed rabbi or this cursed Messiah that would come back from the dead, it's what they would say a tough row to hoe. You're not going to be able to form a religion from that base. And so next up, what we have are what comes up as naturalistic explanations. And These are really easily dismissed because they're really kind of top of your head kind of thinking. They're like, well, what if they just went to the wrong tomb? If they went to the wrong tomb, they were easily confused. Then of course the body seems to be missing. Um, but this is a big scandal in the first century. Roman soldiers are stationed outside for this person who is crucified in Jesus. And rather than just saying, hey, we don't know what happened to the body or the body was stolen, which is what the Jewish people contend after this body is gone, what they could have done is just taken him to the right tomb. I mean, why not just go and go, no, this is the real tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, or this is where the body really was. Look, you can see him. And they could have solved this problem really, really quickly. Also, and mentioned before, is this idea of Jesus swooning, or basically Jesus kind of fakes his death, or maybe he just passes out, not faking his death, but he's really alive. Crucifixion is on record as one of the most horrific ways to die. And when we consider the entirety of Jesus's trial, which is not really up for debate, he's whipped with a cat of nine tails. He has the crown of thorns in his head. Nails go through his wrist and his feet. And typically in crucifixion, well, not typically, but many times they just tie you there. But Jesus emphatically was not, because of the weight of his crime, this charge of blasphemy. And then on top of that, they shove a spear through his side. And so, with all of that taking place, if he's faking, how does he roll the stone away from in front of the tomb? How is he as healed as he possibly is? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And thus, the theory really can be dismissed out of hand. Um, and the other one that has become popular over years, but again, easily dismissed, is, well, if you wanted to dupe people and you wanted to start a religion, just steal the body, right? Steal the body of Jesus and take him somewhere else, and you can be the power brokers of the first century. A couple of things. Number one, in no way were Peter and John and the rest of the disciples power brokers. In fact, if we're to believe the Fox's Book of Martyrs, it tells us that typically they die either from, say, crucifixion upside down, such as Peter in tradition. They're beat with a club. They have rocks thrown at them until they die. It seems incredibly unlikely that people would steal a body, go around ticking off all the people in Jerusalem even further, and then give their lives for a lie. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and ultimately this theory doesn't hold a lot of water. And so, compelling evidence for the resurrection. Here's a few for you. The first one is this: all four Gospels feature women at the tomb. Women are not the best witnesses if you want to advance this belief. Women were generally mistrusted in Jewish society. Even one of the common prayers that is attested, where Jewish men would say, "God, thank you for not making me a Gentile, a woman, or a dog." If you put that list together, that's a pretty atrocious list. And so women only under the rarest of circumstances could go into a court and attest to something being true, to testify. And so the fact that all four gospels hold to the fact that women would be the first one to attest to a resurrection is very, very strong evidence for the fact that there's really no agenda here other than the fact that Jesus truly got out of the grave. The next one is something that I've addressed before, but still important to put here because it is very compelling evidence. Great significance comes from this idea of crucifixion. Now, I mentioned before, it's Deuteronomy 21:23, that the one who dies on a tree is accursed. All of the Jews of this time would believe that dying on a cross is dying on a tree, and thus they hang Jesus there, and he ultimately is cursed. What we would say theologically is Jesus becomes the curse, so we don't have to take the curse. But if we put the theology by the wayside, look to the Gospels and the heft, the weight of the fact that in all four, Jesus is crucified. They are not hiding from the fact that there is a cursed Messiah ultimately. And what are we going to do with this Messiah? A third reason is there are many supposed messiahs, but their movements all died with them. This is one of the more intriguing things to me as I've gone through the New Testament. You look to Acts. By the time that Peter and John face the Sanhedrin, when they face them, you get this kind of throwaway in the story where ultimately one of the men says on the council, look, we've had other people make the claim before, they've died, and nothing has come of them. Well, that's pretty much the story. They had been looking for a general, they had been looking for a politician, somebody to lead them to power and to restore Israel's glory. And all of these people would come about. And when they died, well, their cause died with them, whether it was violent, whether it was upheaval. But with Jesus, who proposes this upside down kingdom, one of which those who were first are last, and he came to serve and not to be served, it's his movement that continues on with him. Now, we could certainly contend that it's because of the strangeness of his message, but we also have to attribute that the strangeness of his message only has power if what he said he was going to do happened, and that is that he died and that he came out of the tomb surely alive. The next thing is just looking at evidence that when people change, there has to be a reason. The disciples, when we see them before Jesus, they're a little brash. Peter wields a sword, but ultimately, after the exchange in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is arrested, everyone scatters from Jesus. And so that's where we're left. We're left to look at these people that, if portrayed accurately, seem very cowardly. But all of a sudden, with the proclamation that Jesus is alive and then ascends to the Father, the disciples are bold. And we see this by the time we get to the Acts chapter 2, where Peter, who seems to have such problems in being consistent in following Christ for a variety of reasons, all of a sudden he is boldly preaching Christ, and he's doing so in the presence of Jewish leaders. And we even go on to see Stephen, as he testifies in front of the Jewish people, ultimately will kill him as well. And so if we see people change, most of the time people don't change unless they're forced to, unless there's something compelling that dramatically changes their life. And the contention here is that the resurrection is something that would radically change the way that they would approach this life in preaching boldly in the name of Christ. Further, though, is interesting is that when it comes down to the Jewish calendar, of course, Saturday is their day of rest. It's the day that in creation God has rested. And so, because of that, it was a day off for the Jewish community. Yet, we see the Jews rapidly changing their day of worship from Saturday to Sunday. Not only would this be a problem when it looks to the perfection of the law that God had already given them, but also this would be burdensome because now, even if they have Saturday off and they rest, they still have to work because Sunday's a work day. They work that whole day. And we see this throughout the book of Acts. We see when Eutychus, a young man who's in the window on the second floor at the end of a long workday, passes out and then ultimately dies and is resurrected there. They're meeting on Sunday evenings. They get into the Lord's day. And you even see this with John, a disciple who writes Revelation. He's caught up in the Lord's day. And so this is, it's recognized to be Sunday. And so there has to be a reason for this change. And the change, of course, is they discovered the tomb was empty on Sunday, the first day of the week. And the final thing that I'd share with you is just this, is that when it comes to tombs, we're really big on trying to make sure that people are honored. So if we have something, we've seen this with Jesus, whether it's the Shroud of Turin, whether it's his cup, this chalice that comes from an Arthurian lore, we always want to venerate those things. And so if there is a tomb for Jesus, you can better believe that we as people will find our way there and put out flowers, and we will venerate that tomb. And Christians have never venerated a tomb claiming to have Jesus's body in it. We do have our best guess. We do have our best estimation if we were to go to Jerusalem. But ultimately, nobody worships that site. We worship the person who left that site empty, wherever that site might be. And so, is there compelling evidence for the resurrection? I would argue, of course, yes. And my stance is I follow Jesus Christ as Lord. But I would say, even if you're just going to follow the evidence, it's important not to stop short. We can't just look at the evidence that meets what we think is the most important thing, that takes our point of view. We have to follow all the evidence. And here are some very compelling reasons that you know what? Jesus changed people. And it wasn't really the death that changed people, it was him coming back to life that did. And so, with that, just depended heavily on a couple of people, Craig Blomberg and the historical reliability of the New Testament, and the arguments, of course, that come from that. And also Craig Keener, who talks a lot about miracles and the idea that miracles don't seem far off for most of the world, even those skeptics to exist. So, anyway, that is all I have. And so, there you go. There are compelling reasons to believe the resurrection.